The gallery erupted in gasps as the curtain dropped, revealing the massive canvas. There it stood, a weathered red barn bathed in golden South African sunset light, every crack and imperfection rendered with such loving detail that viewers felt they could reach out and touch the splintered wood. In the bottom corner, a small signature, Alexandra Chen. The crowd burst into applause. Meanwhile, 12,000 kilometers away, James Matthews stood in that very barn, oblivious that his humble structure had just sold for $2 million, money that would soon find its way to him and change everything. He had no idea that the quiet woman who'd spent a week painting his barn would transform his life forever, but in that moment, as the wealthy art collectors fought over the piece, his destiny was already sealed. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. James Matthews wiped sweat from his brow as he surveyed his failing farm. The South African sun beat down mercilessly, scorching the already parched soil of his 20 hectares. 6 generations of Matthews' men had worked this land in the Western Cape, but it seemed James might be the last. 3 years of drought had devastated his crops, and the bank notices piling up on his kitchen table warned of imminent foreclosure. At 42, his face was weathered beyond his years, deep lines etched around eyes that had seen too much hardship. His wife Miriam had left 2 years ago, unable to bear the constant struggle and isolation. She'd taken their daughter, Nomsa, with her to Cape Town, where they now lived with Miriam's sister. James visited when he could afford the fuel, which wasn't often these days. The only thing on his property that seemed to thrive was the ancient red barn. Built by his great-grandfather, it stood defiantly against the backdrop of the Drakensberg Mountains, its paint faded but somehow holding on, much like James himself. He often found himself sitting on the porch at sunset, watching as the dying light transformed the barn into a glowing ember on the landscape. It was during one such evening that he first saw her. A silver rental car kicked up dust as it approached along the dirt road. Few visitors ever came this way, especially now that word had spread about the farm's decline. James stood, curiosity and wariness mingling as the car stopped and a woman stepped out. She was clearly not from around here. Tall and slender with straight black hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, she wore khaki pants and a white linen shirt that looked too pristine for these dusty surroundings. Asian, perhaps in her mid-30s, she carried herself with quiet confidence. Most notably, she had a large canvas bag slung over one shoulder and what appeared to be an easel tucked under her arm. "Good afternoon," she called, her accent distinctly American. "I'm sorry to intrude. I'm looking for the owner of this property." James approached cautiously. "That would be me, James Matthews. Can I help you with something, Miss Alexandra Chen?" she offered, extending her hand. Her grip was firm, her fingers calloused in a way that surprised him. "But please, call me Alex." James noticed her eyes weren't on him, but rather fixed on the red barn behind him, bathed in the golden light of sunset. There was an intensity in her gaze that made him uncomfortable, as though she were seeing something he couldn't. "Mr. Matthews, I know this is unusual, but I'd like to ask your permission to paint your barn." Of all the things he might have expected her to say, this wasn't one of them. "Paint it? You mean change the color?" A smile cracked her serious expression. No, I'm an artist. I'd like to paint a picture of it. The light hitting it right now is—" She paused, seeming to search for the right word. "Extraordinary. I've been driving through the region for 2 weeks, and nothing has captured me like this structure in this light." James looked back at his barn with new eyes, trying to see what had so captivated this stranger. It was just a barn, weathered and worn like everything else on this failing farm. "I can pay you," she added quickly, mistaking his silence for hesitation. 500 rand for the privilege of setting up here for a few days? The mention of money snapped James's back to reality. 500 grand wouldn't save his farm, but it would buy diesel for the tractor and groceries for the week. It seemed absurd that someone would pay him just to look at his old barn, but he wasn't in a position to question such fortune. "That's really not necessary," he began, his pride wrestling with practicality. "I insist," she said firmly. I never work without compensating the property owners. It's my policy. Something in her tone suggested the matter wasn't up for debate. James nodded, feeling both relieved and somehow diminished. All right then. You're welcome to paint the barn. Do you need anything? Water? A place to sit? Alexandra shook her head. I have everything I need. Thank you. I just need your permission to be on your land. I promise I won't be in your way. And so began the strange arrangement. Alexandra returned the next evening, arriving just before sunset. She set up her easel at what seemed to James a precisely calculated distance from the barn, mixed paints on a wooden pallet, and worked in focused silence as the light changed. Curious despite himself, James found reasons to work nearby. He mended the fence closest to where she painted, taking far longer than the simple job required. Alexandra barely seemed to notice his presence. Her brush moved with confident strokes, her expression one of complete absorption. Occasionally she would step back, eyes narrowed critically at her work, before diving back in with renewed purpose. The farm dogs, usually wary of strangers, settled at her feet as if they'd known her for years. This, more than anything, told James she might be trustworthy. Dogs had a sense about people, his grandfather had always said, and James had found this to be true. As darkness fell, she packed up her supplies with methodical care. The light's gone, she explained when she caught him watching. I'll be back tomorrow, if that's all right. Of course, James replied, surprising himself with how much he meant it. There was something calming about her presence, about watching someone so completely immersed in their work. It reminded him of happier times, when his own passion for farming had been untainted by drought and debt. The pattern continued for several days. Alexandra would arrive before sunset, work intensely for the golden hour, then pack up and leave with minimal conversation. James learned little about her beyond the fact that she was from New York and was taking some time to travel and work. She asked even fewer questions of him, seemingly content to focus entirely on her painting. On the fourth evening, a sudden summer thunderstorm rolled in from the mountains. The sky darkened prematurely, and fat raindrops began to fall just as Alexandra was setting up. You can work from the porch if you like, James offered, gesturing to the covered veranda of his modest farmhouse. The view of the barn isn't as good, but at least you'll stay dry. Alexandra hesitated, clearly reluctant to abandon her chosen spot. But as lightning split the sky and thunder rumbled ominously, she nodded. Thank you, that's very kind. They sat in awkward silence on the porch as rain hammered the tin roof above them. James brought out 2 mugs of rooibos tea, which she accepted with surprise and gratitude. I've been extremely rude, she said suddenly. I've been on your property for days, and I haven't asked a single thing about you or this place. James shrugged. Not much to tell. Farm's been in my family for 6 generations. Droughts made things difficult these past few years. 6 generations? That's remarkable. There was genuine admiration in her voice. In New York, buildings change owners every few years. Nothing has that kind of continuity. Continuity's not always a blessing, James replied, surprised by his own candor. Sometimes it's just a chain. Alexandra studied him over the rim of her mug. For the first time, he felt she was looking at him, rather than through him to the barn beyond. Is that how you see it? As a chain? The question struck uncomfortably close to feelings he rarely articulated. Some days, he admitted, when the bills pile up and the rain doesn't come. Other days. He looked out at the rain now soaking his parched fields, bringing life where there had been only dust. Other days, it feels like a privilege, to be connected to something larger than yourself. She nodded slowly, as though he had confirmed something she'd suspected. The barn, she said, changing the subject slightly. When was it built? My great-grandfather built it in 1897. Used yellowwood from the mountains and iron sheets imported from England. Costed nearly everything he had at the time. My grandfather used to say he loved that barn more than his own house. I can see why. Alexandra's gaze returned to the structure, visible through the curtain of rain. It has soul. Some structures do, you know. They hold the imprint of the people who built them, who cared for them. James had never thought of buildings as having souls, but looking at the barn now, he could almost understand what she meant. That barn had witnessed generations of Matthew's men at their strongest and weakest moments. If anything on this farm had a soul, it would be that sturdy old structure. The rain bar continued through the night, the most substantial downpour the farm had seen in months. By morning, puddles dotted the yard, and a vibrant energy seemed to pulse through the land. Alexandra arrived earlier than usual, eager to capture the barn with raindrops still clinging to its weathered wood. The storm changed everything, she explained excitedly as she mixed new combinations of paint. The quality of light, the textures, the relationship between the structure and the landscape. It's like a completely different subject. James had never heard anyone speak about his ordinary farm with such passion. It made him see his surroundings with fresh eyes, noticing details he'd long ago stopped seeing. The way sunlight caught in water droplets on the fence wire, transforming them into tiny prisms. The contrast between the dark, rain-soaked soil and the faded red of the barn. The dramatic backdrop of mountains, their peaks still shrouded in mist. That evening, as Alexandra prepared to leave, she hesitated by her car. "I think tomorrow will be my last day," she said. "The painting is nearly complete, and I need to move on to some other sites before returning to New York next week." James felt a surprising pang of disappointment. The woman's presence had somehow made his lonely existence less so, even with their minimal interaction. "I'd like to thank you properly," she continued. "Would you join me for dinner tomorrow?" "My treat. There's that small restaurant in the nearest town, the Vineyard, I think it's called." The invitation caught him off guard. "That's very kind, but not necessary." The payment was more than enough. "Please," she insisted. "It would mean a lot to me. This painting, I think it might be something special. I'd like to tell you more about what I plan to do with it." Curiosity won out over pride. "All right then, thank you." The following day, James found himself doing something he hadn't done in months. Looking at his reflection in the mirror with a critical eye. His work clothes were too shabby for a restaurant, even a casual country one like the Vineyard. He rummaged through his closet and found a blue button-down shirt that Miriam had given him 3 birthdays ago. Still crisp in its light film of dust. He paired it with his least-worn jeans and even polished his one pair of leather shoes. Alexandra arrived for her final painting session, dressed as usual in her practical field clothes. She worked with even greater intensity, seemingly racing against the setting sun to capture final details. When at last she set down her brush and began packing her supplies, there was a satisfied set to her shoulders that hadn't been there before. "May I see it?" James asked, realizing she had never offered to show him the painting, and he had never asked. Alexandra hesitated, then nodded. "Of course. It's your barn, after all." She turned the canvas toward him, and James felt a jolt of recognition so powerful it was almost physical. There was his barn, yes. But somehow, more than his barn. Alexandra had captured not just the physical structure, but something ineffable about it, its history, its resilience, its soul. As she might say, the faded red paint glowed with inner light against the backdrop of mountains rendered in cool blues and purples. The foreground showed rain-soaked earth beginning to sprout with new growth, and throughout the painting was a golden quality of light that transformed the ordinary scene into something extraordinary. James found himself at a loss for words. "You've made it beautiful." Alexandra looked genuinely surprised. "It was already beautiful," she said simply. "I just showed what was there." They drove separately to the Vineyard, a small family-owned restaurant nestled among the region's struggling wineries. Despite the area's economic challenges, the restaurant maintained a warm, inviting atmosphere with its stone walls, wooden beams, and flickering candles on each table. James felt awkward and out of place as they were seated. It had been years since he'd dined out, and he was acutely aware of his rough farmer's hands and sun-weathered face among the more polished weekend tourists who frequented the establishment. Alexandra, however, seemed completely at ease, ordering a bottle of local wine and chatting amicably with the server. She'd changed from her field clothes into a simple black dress that managed to look both casual and elegant. "Thank you for agreeing to join me," she said once they were alone with their wine. "And thank you again for allowing me to paint your barn. It's been the highlight of my time in South Africa." James found this hard to believe. "Surely you've seen more impressive sights. Table Mountain, the game reserves, the coastal roads." "I've seen them all," she agreed. "They're spectacular in their way. But there's something about your barn, the way it stands against those mountains, defiant and dignified despite its age and wear." She trailed off, seeming embarrassed by her own eloquence. "I'm sorry. I tend to romanticize my subjects." "No need to apologize. It's nice to hear someone speak about the farm with enthusiasm. It's been in short supply lately." Alexandra's expression grew serious. "You mentioned the drought has made things difficult. Is the farm in trouble?" James stared into his wineglass, debating how much to reveal to this virtual stranger. Something about her direct gaze made dishonesty seem pointless. "The farm is failing," he admitted. 3 years of drought, rising costs, falling prices for what little I can grow. The bank's given me 3 months to make good on my loans before they foreclose." "I'm so sorry," she said, and he was surprised by the genuine concern in her voice. "Do you have family to help?" "My wife left 2 years ago. Took our daughter to Cape Town." He didn't add that he could hardly blame Miriam for escaping a sinking ship. "My parents passed years ago. It's just me now." "And what will you do if you lose the farm?" It was a question he'd been avoiding asking himself. "Find work somewhere, I suppose. I'm not skilled for much beyond farming, but I'm strong enough for manual labor. Maybe join Miriam and Nomsa in the city, though the thought of Cape Town traffic gives me hives." He attempted a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Alexandra nodded thoughtfully. "And if you could save it?" "The farm. What would you do differently?" "Diversify," he answered without hesitation. "The drought taught me that relying on a single crop is too risky. I'd install irrigation systems, plant drought-resistant varieties, maybe add some livestock. The land can support it, with proper management." As he spoke, James felt a familiar excitement stir within him, the same feeling he'd had as a young man taking over the farm from his father, full of plans and innovations. It had been years since he'd allowed himself to imagine a future beyond imminent failure. "You still love it," Alexandra observed. "The farm, despite everything." "It's in my blood," James admitted. 6 generations, like I said. When things were good, they were very good. Working your own land, seeing things grow because of your labor, there's nothing like it. Their food arrived locally sourced vegetables and Cape Malay curry for Alexandra, grilled lamb and potatoes for James. They ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes before she steered the conversation to lighter topics. She told him about growing up in Queens, the daughter of Chinese immigrants who ran a small grocery store, how she'd discovered painting as a teenager and pursued it against her parents' wishes, who had envisioned a more practical career for their only child. "They wanted me to be a doctor or lawyer," she explained. "Something stable and respectable. Struggling artist wasn't exactly their dream for me." "Are they still disappointed?" James asked. A small smile played at her lips. "Not anymore. They've come around." As the evening progressed, James found himself relaxing, enjoying the simple pleasure of conversation with someone new. Alexandra was an attentive listener, asking thoughtful questions about farming techniques and local history. She shared stories of her travels painting landscapes in Patagonia, portraits in Morocco, urban scenes in Tokyo. Her life seemed impossibly exotic compared to his rooted existence. When the bill came, Alexandra reached for it before he could protest. "My invitation, my treat," she reminded him firmly. "Thank you," he said simply, "for dinner and for seeing beauty in my old barn. It's been a long time since I looked at anything on that farm with fresh eyes." "That's what artists do," she replied. "We remind people to really see what's right in front of them." She paused, seeming to debate whether to continue. "James, I'd like to tell you something about myself and about what I plan to do with the painting." Her suddenly serious tone made him curious. "All right. I wasn't completely forthcoming about who I am," she began. "I told you I'm an artist from New York, which is true, But I left out some context. My work is exhibited in major galleries. I'd had shows at the Museum of Modern Art, the Whitney, the Tate, in London. James blinked, trying to process this information. He knew almost nothing about the art world, but even he recognized these as significant institutions. The painting of your barn will be the centerpiece of my new exhibition opening in New York next month, she continued. It's called Resilience, Structures and Spirits in the Face of Change. It explores how human-made structures reflect and embody the resilience of their creators. That's quite an honor for an old barn, James said, unsure how else to respond. Alexandra smiled. The honor is mine, to have found such a perfect subject. But there's something else you should know. When my works sell, I have a personal policy. For paintings like yours, landscapes, or structures where I've been graciously allowed access to private property, share 30% of the sale price with the property owners. James frowned, not following. But you've already paid me for access. The 500 rand. That was just for permission to paint on your land. This is different. When the painting sells, you'll receive 30% of the proceeds. That's very generous, but unnecessary, James said, uncomfortable with what felt like charity. The painting is your work, your talent. But the subject is your heritage, your family's legacy, she countered. I consider it a collaboration of sorts. Besides, she added with a slight smile, it's not negotiable. It's written into my sales contracts. James wanted to argue further, but sensed it would be futile. Well then, thank you. Though I doubt the painting will bring much. Beautiful as it is, he added hastily, not wanting to offend. Something flickered in Alexandra's eyes. Amusement, perhaps, or irony. We'll see, she said simply. My agent will contact you when the exhibition opens. I've left my card and contact information with your payment. They parted ways in the restaurant parking lot. Alexandra was leaving for Cape Town in the morning, then flying back to New York to prepare for her exhibition. Thank you again, James, she said, extending her hand, for sharing your barn and your story with me. He shook her hand, feeling a strange sense of loss at her departure. Safe travels, Alexandra. Good luck with your exhibition. Alex, she corrected with a smile. My friends call me Alex. As he watched her drive away, James couldn't have imagined how significantly this brief encounter would change the course of his life. The weeks following Alexandra's departure fell back into familiar patterns of struggle and worry. The rain that had come during her visit proved to be an isolated event rather than the beginning of a pattern. The temporary green flush across his fields withered under the relentless sun, and the bank notices continued to arrive with depressing regularity. James thought occasionally of the strange American artist, and her fascination with his barn. He'd tucked her business card elegant black letterpress on thick cream paper into his bedside drawer, but held little hope that her promised percentage would amount to anything significant. Even if the painting sold for thousands of rands, 30% wouldn't be enough to save the farm. Exactly 1 month after Alexandra's departure, James was repairing a fence line when he heard his phone ringing inside the house. Few people called his landline anymore, and he almost didn't bother answering. But something made him jog back to the house. Reaching the phone just before it would have gone to his rarely checked voicemail. Matthews Farm, he answered, slightly out of breath. Mr. Matthews? James Matthews? The voice was female, professionally crisp, with an American accent. Yes, speaking. This is Diana Levinson. I'm Alexandra Chen's agent. She asked me to contact you regarding the painting Resilience in Red that features your barn. James felt a small surge of curiosity. Yes? The exhibition opened last night in New York. I'm pleased to inform you that Resilience in Red sold within the first hour. That's wonderful. Please, give Alexandra my congratulations. Ms. Chen asked me to handle the financial arrangements with you directly. As she may have mentioned, 30% of the sale price will be transferred to you. I'll need your banking details. James hesitated, uncomfortable discussing financial matters with a stranger over the phone. May I ask how much the painting sold for? There was a slight pause on the other end of the line. Of course. Resilience in Red sold for $1.2 million. James felt the blood drain from his face. He gripped the counter to steady himself. I'm sorry. There must be some mistake. Did you say million? Yes, Mr. Matthews. 1.2 million US dollars. Diana's voice softened slightly. I take it Ms. Chen didn't discuss potential values with you? No, we didn't. James struggled to form coherent thoughts. That's over 22 million rand. He finally managed, doing the rough conversion in his head. I'm not familiar with the exchange rate, but if you say so. Your share would be approximately 360,000 US dollars, or about 6.6 million rand by your calculation. The room seemed to tilt around James. 6.6 million rand. It was more money than he had ever imagined possessing. Enough to save the farm, install modern irrigation systems, diversify his crops, and still have a substantial safety net. Mr. Matthews, are you still there? Yes, I'm here, he replied, his voice distant to his own ears. I'm just surprised. I understand. Ms. Chen's work commands significant prices, especially her large-format landscapes. Resilience in Red is being hailed as one of her most powerful works to date. The New York Times art critic called it a meditation on endurance and dignity in the face of adversity. James thought of his weathered old barn, standing resolute against the elements for over a century. It seemed a fitting description. If you're comfortable, I'd like to arrange the transfer of funds, Diana continued. Ms. Chen is quite insistent that you receive your share promptly. Still dazed, James provided his banking information. Diana assured him the transfer would be initiated immediately and that he would receive confirmation within 48 hours. One more thing, Mr. Matthews, she added before ending the call. The exhibition has generated significant media interest. Several publications have requested information about the location and owner of the barn and the painting. Ms. Chen has been protective of your privacy, but suggested I ask if you would be open to any interviews or features. James' instinct was to refuse. He had no desire for publicity or to have strangers tramping around his property to see the now famous barn. But then a thought occurred to him. Perhaps this unexpected attention could benefit the struggling farming community around him. I might be open to something local, he said cautiously, if it could help highlight the challenges facing farmers in this region. I'll make a note of that and pass it along. Thank you for your time, Mr. Matthews. Congratulations on being part of such a successful artistic collaboration. After hanging up, James walked in a daze to his front porch and sank into the old wooden chair. From this vantage point, he could see the barn, the million-dollar barn, he thought, with a kind of hysterical amusement. It looked exactly as it always had, weathered, sturdy, unremarkable except for the way the late afternoon light warmed its faded red boards. He tried to see what Alexandra had seen, the quality that had made her painting worth such an astronomical sum. Was it the stark contrast against the mountains behind it? The texture of its aged wood? The history it represented? Whatever it was, it had transformed his greatest liability into salvation. The money arrived exactly as promised. James stared at his bank statement in disbelief, checking and rechecking the figure until he was convinced it wasn't an error. 6,612,483 rand and 21 cents. A life-changing amount. His first action was to pay off the farm's debts in full, marching into the local bank with a satisfaction he hadn't felt in years. The manager, who had been sympathetically but firmly pressuring him about foreclosure for months, was flabbergasted. This is unexpected, Mr. Matthews, he stammered, reviewing the payment authorization. May I ask how you've come into such funds? Art investment, James replied cryptically, enjoying the confusion on the banker's face. Within days, news of his windfall had spread through the small farming community. The story emerged in fragments and grew with each telling. By the time the first journalist from the regional newspaper contacted him, local rumor had Alexandra as everything from a wealthy heiress who had fallen in love with him to a foreign agent using art as a cover for international espionage. The truth, when published, seemed almost disappointing by comparison. Local farmer's barn becomes international art sensation, read the headline in the Western Cape Agricultural Gazette. The article told of Alexandra Chen, described as one of the most important contemporary landscape artists, and her discovery of the Matthews farm. It included a small reproduction of the painting, though the newspaper's printing did little justice to what James remembered of the original. More surprising than the local coverage was the international interest. A writer from an American arts magazine emailed requesting an interview, as did a documentary filmmaker specializing in stories about extraordinary intersections of art and ordinary life. James declined most requests, but agreed to a feature in a South African farming journal that would focus not just on his story, but on the broader challenges facing the region's agricultural community. When the journalist and photographer arrived, James gave them a tour of the farm, showing both the historic barn and the new improvements he was implementing with his windfall. Modern drip irrigation systems were being installed to maximize water efficiency. He had ordered drought-resistant seedlings and consulted with agricultural experts on diversifying his crops. "The money is life-changing," he admitted to the journalist, a young woman who took careful notes as they walked the property. "But I'm trying to be smart about it. This farm has survived for 6 generations because each generation adapted to new challenges. I'm investing in sustainability, not luxury." "And what about the artist?" the journalist asked. "Have you had any contact with Ms. Chen since she left?" "Just through her agent," James replied. He didn't mention the small package that had arrived by courier the previous week, a handwritten note from Alexandra, and a framed, museum-quality print of Resilience in red, now hanging above his fireplace. The note had been brief, but warm. James' reminder to see the beauty in what endures. "With gratitude, Alex." The article, when published, was thoughtful and respectful. It portrayed James not as a lucky recipient of foreign largesse, but as a resilient farmer using unexpected resources to preserve a family legacy and innovate for the future. The piece included quotes from neighboring farmers and agricultural experts praising his forward-thinking investments. What James hadn't anticipated was the response from readers. Within days of publication, his inbox filled with messages from across South Africa and beyond. Some were from other farmers, sharing their struggles and asking for advice on his new methods. Others were from city dwellers, expressing newfound appreciation for the challenges of rural life. A few were from tourists, asking if they could visit the famous barn, which James politely but firmly declined. Most surprisingly, several emails came from potential investors. A sustainable agriculture fund expressed interest in partnering with him to test new drought-resistant crops. A solar energy company proposed installing panels on his property as part of a rural electrification initiative. Even a small local winery suggested collaboration on using a portion of his land for hardy grape varietals suited to changing climate conditions. James found himself in an unexpected position, no longer fighting for survival alone, but at the center of a web of connections and possibilities. He consulted with agricultural experts and lawyers before proceeding with any partnerships, determined to protect the farm's long-term viability. 6 months after Alexandra's visit, the farm had undergone a transformation. Solar panels gleamed on the south-facing roof of the barn, powering new electric systems and feeding excess energy back to the grid. Drip irrigation delivered precisely measured water to diverse crops planted in methodical rows. A small experimental plot hosted drought-resistant wheat, developed by university researchers. The changes weren't just physical. James had hired 3 local workers to help implement and maintain the new systems. He'd reconnected with farming networks he'd withdrawn from during the worst years of struggle, now sharing his experiences and learning from others. And most significantly, he'd reached out to Miriam and Nomsa. The conversation with his estranged wife had been difficult, but necessary. He didn't ask her to return too much had changed for both of them, but he did invite Nomsa to spend school holidays on the farm. To his surprise and joy, Miriam agreed, acknowledging that their daughter needed connection to her heritage. When Nomsa arrived for her first visit, the 10-year-old was initially shy and uncertain, having been away from the farm for nearly a third of her young life. But her natural curiosity soon overcame her reserve. She followed James everywhere, asking endless questions about the new farming methods, the solar panels, and especially the famous barn. "Is it true a painting of our barn is in a museum in America?" she asked, eyes wide with wonder as they stood before the structure. "Not a museum exactly, but an important gallery," James explained. "And now, the painting belongs to a collector who paid a lot of money for it." Nomsa studied the barn critically. "It's just an old building," she declared with characteristic childhood bluntness. James smiled, remembering his own similar reaction when Alexandra had first expressed interest in painting it. "Sometimes it takes someone else's eyes to help us see the value in what we have," he told his daughter. The artist who painted it saw something special, her not just an old building, but a symbol of endurance. Nomsa considered this, her small face serious beneath her braided hair. "Like our family," she said finally. "We've endured too." The simple observation caught James by surprise, a reminder of how children could sometimes cut through complexity to essential truths. "Yes," he agreed softly. "Like our family." That evening, as summer cooled into a gentle night, James sat on his porch with a glass of the region's wine. Nomsa had gone to bed in her old room, which he'd carefully prepared for her visit. The farm dogs lounged at his feet, occasionally raising their heads to investigate night sounds before settling back with contented sighs. From his chair, he could see the barn silhouetted against the star-filled sky. The same view he'd had countless times before, yet now transformed by everything that had happened. Not by the money itself, though that had certainly changed his circumstances dramatically, but by the shift in perspective it represented. Alexandra had seen value where he saw only decay. She had looked at his struggling farm and found not failure, but resilience. And somehow, through her artist's vision, she had enabled him to reclaim his own. James took out his phone and opened the email app. He'd been meaning to write to Alexandra for months, but had never found the right words. Tonight, with his daughter sleeping peacefully under his roof and his farm beginning a new chapter, he finally knew what to say. "Dear Alex," he began, typing slowly with unpracticed fingers. "You once told me that artists remind people to really see what's right in front of them. I didn't fully understand what you meant then, but I do now. Through your eyes, I've rediscovered the value in what I was ready to lose. The barn still stands as it has for over a century, but everything around it is changing. Sustainable systems, diverse crops, new partnerships. The farm isn't just surviving now. It's evolving. My daughter has returned for visits, and seeing her curiosity about this place reminds me daily of why it matters. In your note, you called the painting a reminder to see beauty in what endures. I keep that print where I can see it each day, not just as a reminder of extraordinary good fortune, but of the power of perspective. Thank you for seeing what I could not. With gratitude, James." He read over the message, hesitated only briefly, then pressed send. Whether Alexandra would respond or not, he felt a sense of completion in acknowledging how her brief presence had transformed his life. The morning brought not only birdsong and brilliant sunrise, but an immediate reply from Alexandra. James read it over coffee on the porch, his daughter still sleeping inside. "Dear James, your message brought tears to my eyes. In my work, I seek to capture not just images but essences, the underlying truth of what I paint. The resilience I saw in your barn, I also saw in you, though you couldn't recognize it then. Artists are often credited with special vision, but what we really do is strip away accumulated indifference. We see things as if for the first time, without the numbness that comes from daily familiarity. Your barn was always extraordinary, just as your persistence through years of hardship was extraordinary. The painting merely reflected what was already there." I'm attaching a few photos from the exhibition opening night. The curator positioned resilience in red as the centerpiece, and it drew crowds all evening. When the collector approached me about purchasing it, he spoke of being transported to a place of authenticity. That authenticity was your life's work, not mine. I'm currently in Portugal, painting structures along the Atlantic coast. The light is different here, harsher and more revealing. But I find myself comparing every subject to your barn and finding them wanting. Some landscapes imprint themselves on you that way. My exhibition travels to Cape Town next month. Perhaps you and Nomsa might attend. I would be honored to introduce you both to the art world that has embraced your barn, and by extension, your family's legacy. With warmest regards, Alex. James set down his phone, deeply moved by her words. The photos showed an elegant gallery space with high white walls, crowded with well-dressed people holding champagne flutes. At the center hung the painting of his barn, much larger than he had realized, commanding attention amid smaller works. In one image, Alexandra stood beside it, dressed in a simple black dress, her expression confident yet somehow humble as she gestured toward the canvas while speaking to a group of attentive listeners. He tried to imagine himself in that space, so far removed from his daily reality of soil and sun and struggle. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. But for Nomsa, the exposure to a world beyond the farm, beyond even Cape Town where she now lived with her mother, would be invaluable. Later that morning, as they walked the fields checking the irrigation system, James casually mentioned the invitation to his daughter. An art gallery? With the painting of our barn? Nomsa's eyes widened. Can we really go? If your mother agrees, James said. It's during your school holiday, so the timing works. She'll say yes, Nomsa declared with childish certainty. She told me she's glad the farm is doing better. She worries less about you now. The simple statement touched something deep in James. Despite their separation, Miriam still cared about his welfare. Not in the way of reconciliation perhaps, but in the way of someone who had once shared a life with him and wished him well. Does she? He asked carefully. Nomsa bent to examine a drip irrigation nozzle with exaggerated interest. She keeps the newspaper article about you and the painting in a folder. I saw her looking at it last week. James filed this information away, unsure what to make of it. Their marriage had ended not with dramatic conflict, but with the slow erosion of hope and connection. The drought had taken more than his crops. It had desiccated his marriage as well, leaving it brittle and easily broken. But perhaps there was still goodwill there, a foundation for some new kind of relationship as co-parents if nothing else. That evening, he called Miriam to discuss the gallery invitation. Their conversation was awkward at first, formal in the way of people who knew each other too well once and not well enough now. An art exhibition? Miriam sounded surprised, but not disapproving. In Cape Town? Yes, at the National Gallery. The artist who painted the barn her exhibition is traveling there from New York. James explained the details, feeling strangely nervous, as though asking permission for something more significant than a gallery visit. I think it would be wonderful for Nomsa, Miriam said after a brief pause. She talks about the farm constantly since her visit, and about the famous barn. There was a hint of amusement in her voice. She's welcome to stay here again any time, James said, then added hesitantly, you both are. The silence that followed felt heavy with unspoken thoughts. Thank you, James, Miriam finally replied, her tone softening. Let me know the details for the exhibition, and I'll make sure Nomsa is ready. After they hung up, James sat at his kitchen table, the house quiet around him. He had not expected the invitation to the exhibition to stir up so many feelings. The painting had brought financial salvation, yes, but it was also opening doors to reconciliation of various kinds with his land, his daughter, and perhaps in some small way, with Miriam. The weeks leading up to the exhibition passed quickly. James was busy with farm improvements and planning for the next growing season. He exchanged occasional emails with Alexandra, who was completing her European painting tour before returning to South Africa for her exhibition opening. When the day finally arrived, James and Nomsa drove to Cape Town together. He had purchased new clothes for the occasion, feeling both foolish and justified in the extravagance. Nomsa chattered excitedly throughout the journey, her anticipation making her more animated than he had seen her in years. They met Miriam at her sister's apartment, where she helped Nomsa change into a pretty blue dress that brought out the warm tones of her skin. James felt a momentary awkwardness seeing his estranged wife in the domestic setting they once shared, but Miriam's businesslike efficiency kept the moment from becoming too laden with emotion. "You look nice," she said, glancing at his new clothes with approval. "Very Gallery appropriate. I had some help, he admitted. The shop assistant seemed to know what an art opening required. A small smile played at the corners of Miriam's mouth. I'm sure she did. The National Gallery was illuminated against the darkening evening sky, its classical facade glowing warmly. A banner announcing Alexandra Chen, Resilience hung above the entrance. People streamed toward the doors. Many dressed far more formally than James had anticipated. Are you nervous? Miriam asked quietly as they approached. Nomsa had run ahead, eager to see inside. Terrified, he admitted. I'm a farmer, not an art connoisseur. I'll have no idea what to say to these people. You're the owner of the most famous barn in contemporary art, she reminded him, a teasing note in her voice. That gives you certain privileges, including the right to say very little and just observe. Her words eased his tension slightly. Will you come in with us? Alexandra specifically invited family. Miriam hesitated, then nodded. I'd like to see this painting that changed everything. Inside, the gallery was crowded and humming with conversation. Waiters circulated with trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. Nomsa stayed close to James, suddenly shy in the unfamiliar environment. James scanned the room, looking for Alexandra among the well-dressed crowd. James, you came! He turned to see Alexandra approaching, dressed in an elegant red silk tunic over black pants. She looked more polished than she had on his farm, but her smile held the same genuine warmth. Alex, he greeted her, suddenly self-conscious. Yes, this is my daughter, Nomsa, and Miriam. If Alexandra noticed the awkward introduction, she gave no sign. She shook Miriam's hand warmly and bent slightly to address Nomsa at eye level. I'm so pleased to meet you both. The barn that inspired my painting has been in Nomsa's family for 6 generations. That's longer than the United States has existed, she added with a smile. Nomsa's eyes widened at being addressed so directly by the famous artist. Did you really pay my dad millions of rands for painting our barn? She asked with characteristic directness. Nomsa, Miriam exclaimed, embarrassed. But Alexandra laughed, a genuine sound of delight. In a way, yes, though what I really did was show other people why your barn is special. They're the ones who paid to own the painting. She turned to James and Miriam. Let me show you the exhibition. Resilience in Red is in the main gallery. As they followed Alexandra through the crowded rooms, James noticed people turning to watch them pass, whispering behind their hands. Alexandra seemed oblivious, stopping occasionally to greet someone or acknowledge a compliment with a modest nod. The main gallery was a large, open space with soaring ceilings and dramatic lighting. And there, on the far wall, was his barn. The painting was even more striking than James remembered, the rich colors seeming to pulse with inner light. From this distance, the detail was astonishing. Every weathered board, every play of light and shadow captured with perfect precision. Oh, Miriam breathed beside him. It's beautiful. Nomsa stared up at the enormous canvas, her expression one of wonder mixed with confusion. That's really our barn? That's really your barn, Alexandra confirmed. As I saw it that evening after the rain. A small crowd had gathered around them, listening to the exchange. Alexandra seemed to notice their interest and made a quick decision. Ladies and gentlemen, she addressed the onlookers. I'd like to introduce you to James Matthews and his family. The barn in Resilience in Red has been in their family for 6 generations and continues to stand as a working agricultural structure on their farm in the Western Cape. A murmur of interest ran through the crowd. Several people stepped forward to shake James's hand, asking questions about the farm and the barn's history. To his surprise, James found himself speaking easily about his family's legacy, the challenges of farming in changing climate conditions, and the new sustainable methods he was implementing. The painting changed things for us, he explained to an elderly couple who expressed particular interest. Not just financially, though that's been significant. It changed how I see the farm, how I think about legacy and adaptation. As the conversation continued, James noticed Miriam watching him with an expression he couldn't quite interpret, something like pride mixed with nostalgia. Nomsa had overcome her initial shyness and was enthusiastically describing the solar panels on the barn roof to a bemused art critic. Alexandra stood slightly apart, observing the interactions with evident satisfaction. When there was a momentary lull, she approached James again. "The collector who purchased the original is here tonight," she said quietly. "He's asked to meet you, if you're comfortable with that." James nodded, curious despite his lingering discomfort in these unfamiliar surroundings. Alexandra led him to a tall, distinguished man with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses who was studying another of her paintings. "Mr. Henderson, I'd like you to meet James Matthews, the owner of the barn in Resilience in Red." The man turned, his expression brightening with interest. "Mr. Matthews, a genuine pleasure. Your barn has become a prized centerpiece in my collection." James shook the offered hand, finding it firmer than he'd expected. "I understand I have you to thank for my farm's revival, Mr. Henderson." "Not at all. The beauty was there all along in the structure, in the land." Henderson gestured toward another painting nearby. "I've collected Alexandra's work for years. She has an extraordinary gift for finding dignity in weathered things, don't you think?" "Yes," James agreed, thinking of how she had seen his barn end by extension, his struggling farm not as failing but as persevering. "She sees beneath the surface." "Precisely." Henderson studied James with keen interest. "Alexandra tells me you're using the proceeds to implement sustainable farming methods. I'd be very interested to hear more about that. My foundation supports agricultural innovation in developing regions." The conversation that followed led to an exchange of contact information and a tentative plan for Henderson to visit the farm next time he was in South Africa. By the time James rejoined Miriam and Nomsa, he felt slightly dazed by the unexpected connection. "Everything all right?" Miriam asked, handing him a glass of water. She knew him well enough to see he was overwhelmed. "Fine, just meeting the man who paid over 20 million rand for a painting of our barn. He wants to visit the farm. His foundation funds agricultural projects." Another door opening, Miriam observed. "It seems that way." As the evening progressed, James found himself increasingly at ease in the gallery environment. The initial strangeness gave way to a surprising sense of pride as he watched people engage with Alexandra's work, not just the painting of his barn, but all the pieces that explored themes of endurance and adaptation across different landscapes and structures. Nomsa eventually grew tired, leaning against Miriam with drooping eyelids. They decided it was time to leave, making their way to Alexandra to say goodbye. "Thank you for coming," she said warmly, embracing each of them in turn. "It meant a great deal to have you here." "Thank you for the invitation," James replied. "And for everything. Your painting didn't just preserve an image of the barn, it helped preserve the farm itself." Alexandra smiled. "Art at its best doesn't just represent reality, it participates in it. I'm glad this painting has had such tangible effects." She bent to Nomsa's level again. "And thank you, Miss Nomsa, for taking such good care of that beautiful barn. When you're older, perhaps you'll be the 7th generation to watch over it." Nomsa, despite her tiredness, stood a little straighter at these words. "Maybe," she said thoughtfully. "But I might be an artist like you instead." The adults exchanged amused glances over her head. "You could be both," Alexandra suggested. "The world needs more farmer artists." Outside the gallery, the night air was cool and refreshing after the crowded interior. Stars glittered above the city lights, a reminder of the vast open skies above the farm. "Would you like to get something to eat?" James asked Miriam and Nomsa. "I saw a cafe still open across the street." "Nomsa needs to get to bed," Miriam replied, but added hesitantly, "But perhaps tomorrow, before you head back to the farm, we could have lunch." "I'd like that," James said, surprised and pleased by the suggestion. As they waited for the taxi that would take Miriam and Nomsa home, James felt a curious sense of completion. The evening had connected disparate parts of his life in unexpected ways: his farming heritage and the contemporary art world, his present struggles and future possibilities, his relationship with his daughter, and, perhaps, a new beginning with Miriam. The painting of his barn had started as a stranger's quirky request and become the catalyst for renewal. Alexandra had seen the resilience in his weathered red barn, capturing not just its physical presence but its symbolic importance. In doing so, she had helped James reclaim his own resilience, the determination that had sustained 6 generations of Matthews farmers through drought and flood, war and peace, prosperity and hardship. Tomorrow he would have lunch with Miriam and Nomsa, continuing this cautious reconnection. Next week, Henderson would visit the farm to discuss potential collaboration. And in the coming growing season, the lad would respond to his care with new abundance, nourished by sustainable methods born of unexpected fortune. The taxi arrived, and James hugged Nomsa goodbye. As she settled into the back seat, she rolled down the window. "Dad," she called, her young face serious in the streetlight glow. "I'm glad the lady painted our barn." "So am I, Nomsa," he replied softly. "So am I." As the taxi pulled away, James stood for a moment longer outside the gallery. Through the windows, he could see Alexandra surrounded by admirers, gesturing animatedly as she discussed her work. The painting of his barn glowed on the far wall, a beacon of faded red against the cool blues and purples of the mountain backdrop. 6 generations of Matthews farmers had maintained that barn, seeing it only as a practical structure necessary for their livelihood. It had taken an outsider and artist from a world away to recognize its beauty and significance, and in that recognition, to transform not just how the world saw the barn, but how James saw his own legacy. He turned and walked toward his hotel, the night air cool on his face. Tomorrow would bring new conversations, new possibilities. The farm would continue to evolve, adapting to changing conditions while honoring its long history. And the red barn would stand as it always had, weathered but unbowed, a testament to the enduring power of resilience in structures, in land, and in the human spirit. Back in New York, Alexandra added a small note to the exhibition catalog before it went to press. Beneath the description of resilience in red, she included words James had written in his email to her. "Through your eyes, I've rediscovered the value in what I was ready to lose." The barn still stands as it has for over a century, but everything around it is changing. The farm isn't just surviving now, it's evolving. Visitors to the exhibition paused before the massive canvas, reading these words and feeling, perhaps, something of what Alexandra had felt that evening in South Africa. The quiet dignity of endurance, the beauty of what persists, and the unexpected ways in which art and life intertwine, each transforming the other in an endless cycle of renewal and resilience. And on a farm in the Western Cape, a faded red barn continued to stand against the backdrop of mountains, its weathered boards containing not just the history of 6 generations, but the promise of those yet to come. In its shadow, new crops pushed through fertile soil, nourished by modern systems born of ancient wisdom and unexpected fortune. James Matthews watched over it all, no longer merely surviving but thriving, renewed in purpose and spirit, not just a caretaker of the past, but a steward of the future. Thanks to a chance encounter with a quiet artist who had seen beauty where he had forgotten to look.